I have handed out during the break some articles I've put in the middle of each table. Hope I've put enough. If not, there are a few more at the back. And I might explain that one of them, called The Classic Hayekian Hangover, is one that Gene Callahan and I wrote in the fall of last year. I couldn't resist including in that article the photo of Hayek that certainly looks hungover, okay? But the article was a bit unfortunately timed. We wrote it in late August and early September, documenting even at that time that the economy was in a downturn, and not only in a downturn, but in a classic Hayekian downturn, and we provide evidence in that paper. Unfortunately, by the time we were ready to submit it somewhere, the news was full of nothing but terrorism, and we got crowded out in a number of places. But this will appear in this month's issue of Ideas on Liberty, issued by the Foundation for Economic Education. The second handout that I distributed is a review that I wrote of Bob Woodward's Maestro, a popular book published sometime in 2000. Probably many of you got it in your Christmas stockings in Christmas of 2000. That's where I got my copy. Wrote a review of it, and I'll draw to some extent on that review today. The title of my topic today is The Mechanics of the Business Cycle. And it occurred to me that it might be worthwhile to give you two views. The mechanics is seen by the Austrian school, which for many of you will be just a reminder, you know what the Austrian theory is. And secondly, the mechanics as seen by Alan Greenspan. And here's where I draw to some extent on Woodward's account of Greenspan and his thinking and the equations and so on that he used in deciding what the Fed ought to do. And I think I've produced a reconciliation of sorts. In other words, we'll be able to morph from Greenspan's interpretation to the Austrian interpretation, changing, though, the conclusions dramatically about what the Fed ought to be doing, or whether it ought to be doing anything. There'll be a sub-theme in my talk today, and that's Greenspan's role in the recent unsustainable boom. And I'll make it a multiple choice for you. Is it political chicanery or intellectual error? Just choice A and B. Now, I realize this choice set is not exhaustive. I've left out a few possibilities, including, importantly, all the above. Okay, so in fact, we'll draw conclusions that both of these terms have their application. Now, before I get into either view of the mechanisms of the cycle, let me give you a picture of the landscape here in terms of the unemployment rate, and I'm going to track it from about 1989 to the current period. I don't think many of you can see the labeling on the axis very far back. But I'll remind you that there is something called the natural rate of unemployment. Mises recognized such a rate as suggested by Guido Hulsmann in his lecture last night. Conventionally, that rate, which I've portrayed here in yellow, has a bottom of about 5% and the top of about 6%. Arguably, it has changed some over the last several years, but not much, not dramatically, and over quite a long period of time. It's not a rate that's set in stone, and it can change, but it typically doesn't change dramatically and over a short period of time. It certainly doesn't change over the course of a single business cycle. And I think that's the only thing we need to draw from that rate in this lecture. So full employment here is shown conventionally between 5 and 6%, which rules out the claims of people who thought we'd entered on a new economy, so-called, and one of whom was Greenspan himself, in which somehow the natural rate of interest had dropped to the 4% range. I don't believe it. I don't think we were in a new economy. I think we were in an unsustainable boom. Now, to show you what unemployment has looked like, well, first, I'm just labeling the full employment area, and If the economy goes much above that, we call it recession, or very far above it, depression. If it goes below that, we say the economy is overheated. Just means that there's an unsustainable boom in progress. Okay, let me just show you the unemployment rate over this period. Now, who says the business cycle is dead? Okay, if that doesn't look cyclical, I don't know what does. And it starts, I've got the Bush recession peaking with unemployment at 7.8 and then falling even before the end of the Bush presidency back towards the normal rate or the natural rate, and attaining that natural rate in late 95 and maintaining it in throughout 96. Then you see the unsustainable boom. You see the unemployment falling clear down to the 4% level and below, 3.9 in third quarter of 2000. Just to get your bearings here, I'll put in the presidencies. I'll also indicate, because it's such a momentous event, the September 11th terrorist attack, if only to warn you against the view that it's that attack that's responsible for any large part of our current problems. As you can see from the unemployment rate, unemployment started to rise even at the end of the year 2000 and has continued since that point. Undoubtedly accelerated by the terrorist attack, but not basically attributable to it. There is an inconsistency here in the way that economists think about recessions. If you use this criteria, in other words, just look at the rate of unemployment, we see the economy is still fully employed. It's still within that band, but certainly headed in the direction of recession. The big difference between that reckoning and the one that's more conventionally used is that this focuses on the current situation, where the one that's the most recently used and reported in the news focuses on the direction of change. In other words, the dating of recessions is based on when the downturn began. And of course you can see from this chart that it began in late 2000, which reinforces some of the things that Frank Shostak told us this morning. Okay, so that's, if you want to date the recession from when it began, when the unemployment rate started to rise, and then it goes back to late 2000, but still hasn't yet broken through that full employment range, although undoubtedly will. Now, I'll ask you to memorize this graph for purposes of interpreting the rest of the lecture, but I'll make it easy for you. I don't think you can even read the years, but if you look at the middle of the graph there, you see in mid-1996, the economy was tapering off in the full employment range. And that's the area I want to focus on, because the economy, by this criteria, was at full employment with a soft landing in the process, or seemingly so, and then it made the downward trek clear to 4%. Okay, how so? Why so? I believe the critical point was late January of 1996, and mind you, this was the year that Clinton was up for re-election. It's a point where Greenspan, for the first time during the the Clinton presidency, did something that was at odds with the macroeconomic theory and based on political motivation. You see, when Clinton first took office, the economy was well into recession, and what Greenspan was doing was exactly what mainstream macroeconomists would want him to do: keep interest rates low, stimulate the economy, and so on, until it gets back down to the full employment range, at which point he's supposed to rein it in and engineer a soft landing. And so only in early 1996 did Clinton face a dilemma. What does he do? Or, I'm sorry, does Greenspan face a dilemma? What does he do? Does he do the politically helpful thing to Clinton, or does he do the macroeconomically sound thing according to mainstream macroeconomists? So it's the context that makes that episode important. And in January of that year, he lowered interest rates once again. It's also important to note that even at the time, the financial press, and here I mean the mainstream press, reported that reduction as unwarranted and as most likely reflecting political considerations and not economic considerations. Okay? So those sorts of actions in a period when the economy was already in the full employment range is what set the economy on that downward trend in terms of unemployment rates, and also created the very kind of conditions that caused Greenspan to get his story wrong. He took it as genuine growth when, in fact, it was Fed-stimulated growth. Okay. Now, the Austrian theory of boom and bust. Here I'm going to draw, but only lightly, on my own book, Time and Money. And I'm going to present the supply and demand for loanable funds is almost an unfortunate term, supply and demand for loanable funds, or the loanable funds market. The Austrians, dating clear back to Bombewerk, have used this market, supply of loanable funds, which is simply people's willingness to save, and demand for loanable funds, that's the willingness of business firms to borrow those savings and invest, or acquire those savings through the issuing of equity shares, for instance, and invest. This is what makes it a misnomer, that it doesn't mean literally bank loans, okay? It means any form of saving that facilitates the adding to the capital structure. So I note here that Bombewerk and even Keynes, I mean, this is not really a disputable point. Bombewerk and even Keynes said that a better name for this graph is the supply and demand of investable resources. In other words, out of current production, a lot of it is consumed, and the part that's not consumed is made available to increase the capital stock or to build on the capital structure. All right? So that's what's meant by investable resources. The quantity axis there measures both saving, people's willingness to finance those investments through their saving or buying equity shares or whatever, and investment, the willingness of business people to use those savings to undertake investment projects. I'll show that on the graph, supply and demand for loanable funds, and that only at an interest rate shown here as 5%, which is purely for illustrative purposes, we have saving equal to investment. Okay, the people undertaking investments, that's just right. It's just the amount that income earners are willing to support. I think, listening to Frank Shostak's talk this morning, that that measure, that supply equals demand, saving equals investment along the horizontal axis, is what constitutes the pool of funding. He uses that term fairly often, and I understand pool of funding as to mean just that. It's resources available to add to the capital structure. Now, it's important that this market be allowed to work, which is to say it's important that the interest rate tell the truth, that the interest rate reflect market conditions in the loanable funds market. And if it does, if the interest rate does reflect those conditions and especially reflect changes in those conditions, then the market will work fine. Investment will be governed by the existing pool of funding or the existing amount of savings available. Things go wrong, of course, when the interest rate reflects instead activities by a proactive central bank. All right, so this text tells you that. I've indicated here that the supply reflects people's willingness to save, and it's important that changes in their willingness to save get accurately reflected in this market. And people can decide to save more than before. It's odd that we as macroeconomists have to emphasize that people can change their preferences. But in the face of Keynesianism, who argues the opposite, Keynes argues that the marginal propensity to save is fixed. It doesn't change, depends only on people's income and not on any supposed change in saving preferences. But surely that's wrong. People can change their decisions about how much to save. They might want to save more for retirement, thinking Social Security won't help them out that much, or they might want to save for their children's education, or save for any number of other reasons. All right, and if they do save, it changes the interest rate and has a direct effect on the capital structure. Let's show that. An increase in saving would simply be a rightward shift of that supply of loanable funds curve. So let's let it shift right, reflecting people have decided to save more now. If that happens, of course, it drives down the interest rate from 5 to 2.3. The numbers aren't important. And moves the economy down along that demand for loanable funds schedule. In other words, at lower interest rates, investors undertake more investment activities, and more importantly, not shown here, but shown in time and money, it affects the pattern of investment. In other words, not only is there more investment made possible by the increased savings, but the lower interest rate that stimulates that more investment also governs the temporal pattern of investment. It causes investment undertakings to be relatively more long-term, because long-term investments are more sensitive to interest rate changes than our short-term projects. Okay, so the economy takes on a longer time horizon, invests for the remote future, and hey, that's perfectly consistent with the hypothetical preference change that brought it about. In other words, when people save, they're saving up for something. They're foregoing current consumption in order to be able to consume more in the future. And the interest rate change that comes out of that will do just that trick. Okay, it will cause production activities to be aimed at that further point in the future. Again, I might note here that this gets emphasized in Time and Money and by Austrian economists generally, precisely because Keynes denied it. If you remember your Keynesianism, you get the idea that any increase in saving impinges not on investment in a positive way, but rather on income in a negative way. That saving more ends up causing you to earn less. The economy goes into recession. It's called the paradox of thrift. So Keynes has built into his own economics a perversity that forbids increase in saving to get translated into an increase in investment. Okay, gets translated instead into depression. This mechanism that I'm showing you here shows how the market can work right. Okay, and again, this text tells you just what I said, so you don't need to read it. Now, it turns out that we might have a situation where there hasn't been any increase in saving. Supply and demand conditions are what they are, and they stay that way. The interest rate needs to stay at 5%. The economy's growth rate reflects that, and here, just for illustrative reasons, it shows saving and investment are equal to 800, probably 800 billion, because this is a macro figure. This is for illustration. Actual saving and investment in this economy are about twice that, about 1,600 billion at the current time. Okay. If monetary expansion pushes the economy to grow faster, the increased growth rate is not sustainable. In other words, now what I want to show you by contrast, what if that supply of loanable funds is shifted to the right, not by people deciding to save more, but by a central bank decision? It's a totally different kind of process, although it looks for all the world to be very similar. That's what gives rise to the problem. Market signals that look like they reflect an increase in saving turn out to have reflected nothing but some proactive policy position. And I'm not naming names, but shows you basically different nature of the process. We're not talking here about a market economy at work for you and for me. We're talking about a single institution, a single man really, who makes decisions to influence the interest rate. Okay, and that decision can end up increasing the supply of loanable funds. And so what I want you to note is how similar that graph looks to the earlier one, which actually showed an increase in saving. Okay. This one, though, is not an increase in saving. In fact, quite the contrary. Let's just look here. Pumping money through credit markets has the effect initially that are similar to the effects of increased saving. Okay, the interest rate decreases, you can see that. Increased investment is accompanied by a decrease in the saving magnitude because the old savings function is still the right one. And so at the lower rate of interest, people save less. Okay, they're not getting as much interest for their money, so they save less, which is to say they consume more. So this is this is what sets the economy at war with itself. On the one hand, you have investors investing more and investing for a longer term, while at the same time you have consumers, far from making that possible by increasing their saving, cut against it by increasing their current consumption. All right, so they're draining from the pool of funding, as Frank termed it, at the same time where investors are making decisions that count on a larger pool of funding. All right, so this is what sets the economy against itself. The process doesn't play itself out as economic growth; it rather does itself in when it turns out that those investment projects cannot all be completed. That gives you the bust, the downturn. That's the story of the business cycle. So look at this little triangle. Memorize it too. You're moving along the demand curve, increasing investment, moving back along the supply curve, decreasing saving. And of course the base of that triangle, the horizontal component, is precisely the quantity of money that the Fed created and pumped in through credit markets. All right? That's what's maintaining the wedge between saving and investment. That's the mechanism as identified by the Austrians. Now, this says what I've just told you, but I do introduce Ludwig von Mises' own terminology for this, that he says the artificial boom is characterized, and this is a term he used repeatedly in human action, malinvestment and overconsumption. Okay? So the malinvestment is investment activities aimed at the too far distant future. The overconsumption is the excessive consumption brought on by the low rate of savings, and that explains the bust. Now, in the few short minutes remaining, I want to talk about Greenspan's theory of productivity. Now, why is that funny? It's not a coincidence, by the way, that it almost sounds like Einstein's theory of relativity. Greenspan read Einstein, and he actually thought his theory was a macroeconomic equivalent of that. In mid-1996, after Greenspan had decreased the interest rate, he noticed that things were picking up. The economy seemed to be growing faster. And he came up with a formula that we won't contest directly, except we need to put it on a per unit basis. He says price equals labor cost plus non-labor cost plus profits. Well, duh, okay. In fact, this was as reported by Bob Woodward, and we can see that if we correct for the per unit basis, it's an accounting identity. Per unit profits equals price minus per unit cost. Yes. Okay. And costs equal labor cost plus non-labor cost. Okay. I've got my graduate assistant working on that one. Okay. So if we put it on a per unit basis, it looks like that. In other words, per unit I'm dividing by the quantity of output. And Greenspan managed to change this from what really is a truism into an economic profundity, or he thought it was, because he observed, for instance, that profits are rising. That's that numerator in that third term. But non-labor costs, just a numerator there, are not changing. The wage rate's not changing, and neither was employment at the time. So labor costs are constant, and prices weren't changing much. There wasn't much price inflation. And so he concluded that the only way this equation can hold true, if the mathematicians among you will see it, is if Q is rising. In other words, if you're getting more output per unit of labor, he declared this an increase in productivity and used it to justify increasing the money supply, because with more output you can pump in more money without affecting prices. Okay? He actually set his staff to work on documenting this and argued that, the staff supposedly thought of their job as tantamount to the Manhattan Project, okay, documenting. And I'll just give you an alternative explanation that squares perfectly with the Austrian theory. Okay, I'm going to write the symbols differently, so the cost of capital, or the interest rate times the amount of capital, I'll leave unchanged the other things that Greenspan had observed. But what's happening here, of course, is that the interest rate, let me make this thing click. It didn't want to click for me. There it is. The interest rate fell because Greenspan lowered it, and as a result, capital in the industries he was looking at rose as as they allocated more capital to those industries, which leaves the non-labor cost relatively unchanged in that period, and that's what gave rise then. That's what gave rise to the increase in quantity. In other words, it was of his own doing, and not because we'd entered upon a new economy of some sort. And so the reason that things were happening was because that interest rate fell, and not because somehow labor had become inherently more productive. And I summarize it for you here, saying to help Clinton in his re-election bid, Greenspan decreased interest rates even though the economy was already at full employment. Then he misinterpreted the increase in output that characterized many sectors, but not all, of the economy as a general increase in labor productivity. It wasn't general, okay? That would raise output in all sectors. And he concluded that the money supply could be further increased without causing inflation. And so there's the political chicanery, as I reported here. Political chicanery leveraged by intellectual error. And so there you have it. Okay, thank you much. Could you have overinvestment across all?
Across all of
actually, that question would get you different answers depending on whether you read Hayek or Mises. It's Mises who does argue that there can, in fact, he says even overconsumption, which is excessive use of resources even at the final stage. All right, but on top of that, superimposed on top of that, is a relative misallocation. So what I would argue, and do argue in time and money, that you get both. That you get an increase in investment all around that's very temporary, or that's inherently temporary, and at the same time a pattern of investment that actually pulls the Hayekian triangle at both ends against the middle. You get excessive consumption as identified by Mises, and you get excessive investment in the long-term sectors as recognized by both Mises and Hayek. Okay, so I would say you get both, and I would say that the market mechanisms that bring the boom to an end are very critically tied up with the malinvestment aspect. Because if you think about it, what's happening, and again I'll go back to Frank Shostak's pool of funding. At the very time the pool is being drained by consumers, investors are setting off on a course that would require a larger pool. Okay, and so as that process moves forward, and as stages of production in the intermediate range mature to fruition, the consumable output simply isn't as great, and so at that point consumption has to be reduced. In fact, that's the reduction in consumption that I think is best described by the term forced saving, okay, which is integral to almost all the Austrian accounts of the business cycle.
And Professor Stromberg, you mentioned that bad policy begets bad policy. I've heard this question before, but why doesn't that inevitably lead to the U.S. being some sort of Marxian utopia? Is there some cultural constraint that bad policy eventually leads to good policy?
Well, no, not really. In fact, I'd like someone to guarantee me that we're not turning into a Marxist utopia, first of all. But okay, with a certain gradualism, I suppose. But if you read certain publications, including some of them claim to be conservative, you find a certain wholesale adoption of themes that used to be those of the Marxists and so forth. So,
neoconservative is a socialist.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough in several senses, but well, it may be partly that it's cumulative one, intellectual error can just apparently persist for quite a long time. But it's not just that. It means once the process has gone on long enough, you've got a whole class of entrenched people who believe this, but it's also in their interest to have other people believe this. And when these people, in effect, nationalize the educational system of an entire country and create the predominant paradigms that you get from first grade through the universities, and they also have an interest in perpetuating these views, it becomes very difficult for anybody to sort of think their way out of the paper bag. And also, again, and it's also partly maybe just a kind of logistical problem that it's much simpler for a few sugar producers to go to Tallahassee or send lobbyists to Tallahassee to figure out some way to raise the price of sugar than it would be for all the sugar buyers in Florida to organize themselves to save that couple of cents. And it's just a few pennies on the dollar for the single consumer, but it means a lot to the guys who send the lobbyists. So there's sort of a structural problem. I suppose it's analogous to the so-called public goods and free rider problems, but it's another story.
Let me add something. I think Mises' explanation of this has to do with the notion that we tend to lose freedom gradually. Okay, you tend not to see a society that's moving gradually towards freedom. Okay, it takes something more momentous to try to get back some freedom. So you move towards away from freedom gradually. I've heard it called the potato chip theory of regulation. You can't eat just one. You can't impose just one policy on another.
The back. Yes. Joe, this is sort of a sidelight to your talk, but I was curious, and maybe other people are. Was charisma the main explanation for Roosevelt's 36 re-election, given that, he hadn't solved the pressing problem that got him elected?
Well, I don't know, I suppose you could say that the Republican Party has a sort of built-in genius for not finding a candidate that's going to persuade anyone. That's always you always have to allow for that. But yeah, I suppose that the charisma was a big factor. And although I don't know, there were people like John T. Flynn was one who said that he voted for Roosevelt the first time he ran when he appeared to be a Cleveland Democrat and never voted for him again. And my father did the same thing, voted for him once and then never again. But apparently some people didn't react badly to the sets of policies that were being put in place and vote against him on that basis, but maybe thought this might work, or maybe he somehow did create this notion that something was being done. And I mean, you've got to remember they're putting all these people out there with shovels and planting trees, and they've got a lot of activity going, and they're getting a lot of press, and they keep a lot of excitement, and they're slaughtering little pigs to raise the price and all of that. So maybe that was enough.
Can I say this? In that particular election, the campaign sloganeering was very candid and very explicit. It was spend, 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 elect, elect, elect. Okay, we got a lot of votes, with or without charisma. Okay, there was people after the election that said, they told me if I voted for Alf Landon, there'd be more years of depression. And so I did, and there was.
You also have to remember that Roosevelt took us off prohibition, and that made a lot of people happy as well. Way back then.
Yes, Dr. Garrison, in your article on classic hierarchy and hangover, you talked about MZM growth. And would you agree with some academics subtracting money market funds from MZM in their calculation of money supply growth?
Quite possibly, but of all of the statistics that are reported routinely by the central bank itself, I tend to look at MZM rather than M1 or the monetary pace. I think it's a better indicator.
Here in the middle?
Me?
Yes.
Dr. Garrison, would you comment on the so-called hedonic price adjustments that are used by government statisticians to artificially make productivity and output look better in inflation, and also inflation look better as sort of artificial price adjustments that give a totally irrelevant and incorrect picture of how the U.S. economy actually performed over the last 5 years?
Yeah, of course, those kind of adjustments are so prone to chicanery and to making figures say what you want them to say. It's something I don't think is much worth looking at those statistics that tell the story.
I mean, is that simply political chicanery?
Well, it certainly invites it, and it's hard to establish that they've got just the right economic price.
And that's institutionalized now, isn't it, in the calculation of the CPI?
Well, in a lot of it, in imputing the value of goods that aren't traded and so on. Yeah.
I want to add one thing about the moral hazard, if I could.
Go ahead.
Yeah. There's now there's sort of a small literature now. There's articles in the political science journals that have titles like the 4-year presidential business cycle. So the political scientists, at least, have figured out the way in which there's an attempt to actually fine-tune fiscal policy to presidential elections. And of course, the general public is even beginning to catch on to this, that the president gets in, and if the economy is quote-unquote sluggish, then he'll have Allen do something with the money supply, and then if he's lucky and the timing works out for them, then he'll be re-elected while this is still working. Sometimes it doesn't work.
In your Roger, in your presentation, you tied the unemployment rate with the concept of sustainable growth. Are there other measures in the economy that would track out similarly, and why do you pick the unemployment rate?
Well, I'm using the unemployment rate just because I think it shows pretty vividly the unsustainable period of growth. But you can also look at long-term capital investments. I mean, in the article that I handed out, the one point we make is that particular unsustainable boom was certainly characterized by long-term investment. It was an investment boom and an investment bust, and all sorts of businesses who were operating on a current negative cash flow but hoped for profits in the next decade or whatever were the ones that went down, like the dot-coms, for instance. A lot of the dot-coms were jump-started and up and running with negative cash flows and not even anticipating to turn profits for 10 or 12 years. And that's the very kind of activity that you could track to verify the Austrian theory. And that's what we saw in that period.
Is anybody doing any work on trying to actually trace where these monetary injections go and how they go?
It's very difficult doing it on an industry by industry or sector by sector basis. But essentially, you want to just watch what's happening to interest rates, because that's going to cover what kinds of investment get undertaken in whichever industry happens to be undertaking them. Okay.
Dr. Garrison, one point you didn't raise about Greenspan is his bailouts. I think there was Mexico, and then there's Asia, and there's a series of sort of intervention in the stock market, and then after September 11th, in considering the relationship between political chicanery and intellectual error, how do you account for this aspect of Greenspan's rule?
That's difficult, and a lot of the things he did were very much counter to the whole operation of the Fed, or what it's supposed to do. And he was violating even Fed procedures and taking a public stance and using the Federal Reserve to help long-term management funds and that sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's Greenspan himself, in response to some of Woodward's questioning, likened it to a fire truck going the wrong way down a one-way street to put out a raging fire. Okay, we're not supposed to do it, but hey, to find a worse evil, we'll commit this one.
Okay. Any more questions? Right there in the middle.
That's Dr. Garrison. When you're looking for a definition of malinvestment, is there any reason why it just can't be simply defined as any project whose internal rate of return doesn't return its weighted average cost of capital? As simple as that.
No, it's not quite as simple as that, because now that might help. I mean, in some cases you might identify some, but with the Austrian theory, what's very critical is that investment projects, as used by Hayek, that term is used by Hayek or Mises or whatever, refer to projects that are seen through several different stages of production and are in the hands at different times of different firms. Okay, where outputs of one firm sell as inputs into the next firm. All right, so there's some vertical relationship between the different firms that eventually give rise to consumer goods. And so the internal rate of return that you would have to look at, if you could look at it, would be the rate of return that would apply to the entire project that spans several firms. And those are figures that aren't available. They're not calculated by the individual firms. In fact, they're not within the scope of individual firms to calculate. That's one of the problems. That if somehow industry had a way of making those calculations from the outset, they probably wouldn't engage in those activities. Okay.
They would they not? Because they're looking at a false.
Right. The calculations they're making are based on wrong signals. I mean, prices really are signals, and if the signals are distorted, the calculations are going to be wrong. And despite the whole so-called rational expectations revolution, we can't simply assume that just because a firm knows or suspects that a signal is wrong, that he knows what the undistorted signal would be. Okay, that information is simply not available. But it may well be that the rate of return, internal rate of return, that's unique to a specific firm that's engaged in part of the project, may show it profitable based on prices that they're facing. Okay, and yet it may be in the end that this project, after it's been sold as output, as input to the next firm, and so on, in the end the whole thing may turn out to be unprofitable, but there's no way to calculate that in advance.
Okay. No matter what, the weighted average cost of capital that they're looking at is actually higher than it appears to be.
Sure. Sure.
Yes, if I could put you both on the spot, could you both provide your GDP forecast for 2002? Make a slide.
Well, I don't think I'll deviate from what Joe Salerno said. I won't put numbers on it, but you know, the freight or the recession may well bottom out in mid-year of 2002. I won't put any figures on it though. Someone else might want to. What do you think?
I don't know. I'm just a historian. I try to avoid this kind of prediction. So I'm sorry.
Joe, do you see things happening with this administration and this Congress that we've already tried and we've done before in the past in similar crashes or panics that would lead one to sort of make a guess as to what we have to look forward to in the next 3 to 4 years? Are we making mistakes that we've made before?
Well, sure. They're infinitely replicable or repeatable. They can always make the same mistake again. Up until some point, I guess, that approaches the total collapse of the system or a hyperinflation or something, they can apparently do this over and over without learning a great deal. So that's not a very optimistic answer, I suppose. But
well, actually, I'm referring more to Congress and policy, not necessarily the Fed.
Well, no, I was including. I think I was including Congress. But I mean, Congress has to vote these bailouts, and the bailouts are going. I mean, there's no real chest of money hidden away in the back of the White House to finance the bailouts. I mean, they're going to bail out the insurance industry. They're going to bail out everybody who even knew anybody who was involved in the Twin Towers. It's becoming very large. It's a huge, and then there is the cost of this war or whatever it's being called lately. There's all that. There's this whole, but they love that, you know, that you can always sell a military action, and particularly in a situation like this when there's been the actual terrorist attack. So there's just, I'm frankly wondering how they're going to actually be able to exert any of their famous control with the amount of money they're proposing to lay out in all these areas. But perhaps they have acquired some general feeling for how to keep the thing from becoming just a runaway situation. So I don't know. I mean, not only do you have just the normal political motivations for pursuing the same bad policies again, now you've also got this added dimension of bailout, world empire, the responsibilities of being the last remaining superpowers. It seems to me it's quite colossal. And in these proposals, we're going to bail out all these other failing economies. There's bound to be some price. I don't know how high it will be. I mean, for the American people, for the American economy, that's something I wish I knew. But I don't know if that directly answered your question. But it seems to me, yeah, H.L. Mencken once said nobody ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American voter. But I would say, well, nobody ever went broke underestimating the rascality of these people in power. I don't know. There's very few restraints on them other than the danger of possibly not being reelected, and it takes a lot to not be reelected now. So.